The train's brakes screamed against steel, and through the dust-caked windows, Oberst Friedrich Steiner caught his first glimpse of Texas. August 1943. The landscape stretched endless and flat, punctuated by oil derricks and cotton fields that shimmered in heat waves rising from scorched earth. Nothing like the African desert, where Rommel's Afrika Korps had bled out months earlier, but equally unforgiving in its own way. Steiner pressed his face closer to the glass. 500 men packed into those railcars, all wearing the same faded Wehrmacht uniforms, all carrying the same questions behind their eyes. What waited for them in this place called Hearne? Population 10,000, according to the intelligence briefing they'd received aboard the transport ship crossing the Atlantic. A nothing town in the middle of nowhere, chosen precisely because it was nowhere. The rumors had started during that Atlantic crossing, whispered in the holds of converted cargo ships, passed between bunks in the dead hours before dawn. Some said the Americans executed prisoners far from Geneva Convention observers, that these rural camps served as convenient disposal sites where international authorities would never look. Others insisted on torture, on medical experiments, on all the horrors that men imagine when facing an uncertain fate. Lieutenant Hans Müller, 23 years old and already a veteran of Tobruk and El-Alamein, had laughed off those rumors. The Americans worship their rules, he'd said, with the confidence of someone who'd intercepted enough Allied communications to believe he understood the enemy. They're slaves to their paperwork and protocols, will probably die of boredom before brutality. But laughter came easy on ships. Now, as the train jolted to a stop and American MPs began unlocking the doors, Müller's confidence flickered. The humid Texas air hit like a physical force when those doors opened. 100 degrees, maybe more. Thick and heavy, nothing like the dry heat of North Africa. It wrapped around them, squeezed their lungs, made their wool uniforms feel like punishment. "Raus! Raus!" an American sergeant shouted in terrible German, then switched to English. "Out! Form up in rows of 5. They stumbled onto the platform, a simple wooden structure that had seen better decades. Local civilians had gathered, kept at a distance by MPs with Thompson submachine guns slung across their chests. The Texans stared with open curiosity. Not hatred, Steiner noted with some surprise. Not even particularly hostile. Just curious, like tourists at a zoo studying some exotic specimen. The march to Camp Hearne covered 2 miles of dirt road. Guards flanked the columns, but walked with a casualness that struck the Germans as almost unprofessional. These Americans chatted with each other, joked, occasionally offered water from their canteens to prisoners who stumbled in the heat. One young MP, couldn't have been older than 19, asked in broken German if any of them had played soccer for a professional club. He supported something called the Brooklyn Dodgers and wanted to know if German sports leagues were similar. Captain Werner Schultz, a career officer who joined the Wehrmacht in 1935, found the whole scene deeply unsettling. In his experience, guards maintained distance. They exerted authority through posture, through rigid adherence to protocol, through the implicit threat of violence for non-compliance. These Americans acted more like factory foremen than prison wardens. It felt wrong. It felt like a trap. Camp Hearne revealed itself gradually as they marched. First came the perimeter. 12-foot chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire, punctuated by guard towers every 100 yards. Standard enough. But beyond the wire lay something unexpected. Row upon row of whitewashed wooden barracks, identical but oddly pleasant, neat, well-maintained. Between the buildings, prisoners could see vegetable gardens, a baseball diamond, what appeared to be a chapel with a proper steeple. "This is the camp?" Sergeant Fritz Hauser muttered to no one in particular. Tank commander, 21st Panzer Division, veteran of France and Africa. "Where are the punishment blocks, the interrogation facilities?" They processed through slowly. American efficiency meant paperwork, lots of paperwork. Each prisoner gave name, rank, serial number. They were fingerprinted, photographed from 3 angles. Issued new clothing, blue denim work shirts and pants, brown boots that actually fit properly. Their Wehrmacht uniforms were taken away for cleaning and storage. One private, a kid from Bavaria named Franz Brunner, nearly wept when they confiscated his military decorations. A corporal reassured him in surprisingly good German that everything would be catalogued and returned when the war ended. When the war ended, not if. These Americans already assumed victory. The barracks assigned to Steiner's group housed 50 men in a single long room lined with bunk beds. Each bunk had a thin mattress, 2 wool blankets, and a footlocker. Windows on both long sides could be opened for ventilation. Bare electric bulbs hung from the ceiling every 20 feet. It was Spartan, certainly, but cleaner than many Wehrmacht barracks Steiner had occupied during the war. No lice visible, no rats scurrying in corners, no smell of human waste inadequately disposed of. An American lieutenant, a bookish-looking man in glasses, who introduced himself as Lieutenant Morrison, addressed them in flawless German. "You will be housed here for the duration of your detention. Meals are served at 0700 hours, 1200 hours, and 1800 hours in Mess Hall C, which you passed on the way in. You will receive work assignments based on rank and skills. Officers are exempt from manual labor under Geneva Convention rules. Questions will be addressed to your barracks leader, who you will elect among yourselves. Medical facilities are available. If you're sick, report to your barracks leader, who will arrange transport to the infirmary. Male privileges will be explained tomorrow. Do not attempt to escape. This is Texas. You could walk for a week in any direction and find nothing but hostile terror-aware locals and death by exposure. You're safer inside these fences than outside them." That last part landed strangely. Safer inside. What kind of prison camp advertised its own security as prisoner protection? The first meal answered some questions and raised others. Dinner consisted of beef stew, actual beef, not the mystery meat that had sustained them during the final months in Africa, served with white bread, real butter, green beans, and coffee. Not ersatz coffee, made from burnt grain, but actual coffee that smelled like heaven and tasted like resurrection. The portions were generous. Men who'd survived on half rations for months ate slowly, almost reverently, afraid this would be their last decent meal before the real camp conditions revealed themselves. "It's poisoned," someone suggested, half joking. "They're fattening us up before the interrogations begin." But the interrogations never came. Or rather, they came so casually that many prisoners didn't recognize them as interrogations. Officers from intelligence units would sometimes sit with prisoners during meals, asking conversational questions about hometowns, peacetime occupations, opinions on American music or movies. The questions felt random, unthreatening. Only later would Steiner realize these relaxed conversations provided better intelligence than any formal interrogation possibly could. Men who felt comfortable talked more freely about unit compositions, morale problems, supply shortages, officer competencies. The Americans were cleverer in ways the Germans hadn't anticipated. The first week established routines: wake at 0600 hours, roll call at 0630 hours, where guards counted heads but showed no particular urgency or hostility about the process. Breakfast, then work details for enlisted men. Officers spent their days in a strange limbo. They could read from the surprisingly well-stocked camp library, attend educational classes taught by fellow prisoners, exercise in the recreation yard, or simply sit and contemplate their situation. Captain Schultz used his time to observe and analyze. This is what officers did: assessed situations, identified patterns, formulated theories. And Camp Hearne presented a wealth of patterns that didn't fit any framework he understood. The American Guards, for instance. They rotated through the camp on regular schedules, but many were older men, clearly beyond draft age, or younger men with obvious physical limitations. One guard walked with a pronounced limp. Another wore thick glasses that would have disqualified him from frontline service. This wasn't America's warrior elite standing watch. These were the men left behind while the real soldiers fought overseas. Yet despite their apparent limitations, they maintained order effectively. Prisoners respected the rules not through fear of violence, but through some more subtle mechanism Schultz couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was simply that the conditions were good enough that rebellion seemed pointless. Why fight a system that fed you well, housed you decently, and treated you more humanely than your own army had during the final months of the North African campaign? The canteen proved particularly fascinating. Prisoners could use government-issued script to purchase items like cigarettes, candy bars, toiletries, even musical instruments and art supplies. The prices were marked in English and German. Each prisoner received 80 cents per day in scrip for work performed, and officers received a smaller monthly allowance for basic necessities. It was capitalism in miniature, functioning behind barbed wire with American efficiency. Schultz bought a notebook and 3 pencils his first week.
He'd decided to document everything, maintain a detailed record that might prove useful after Germany's inevitable victory. The teenager working the canteen counter, another prisoner, a former shopkeeper from Hamburg, had smiled at the purchase. "Planning to write your memoirs, Herr Hauptmann?" "Something like that," Schultz had replied, not mentioning his true purpose: intelligence gathering, pattern analysis, anything that might help understand these strange Americans who imprison you comfortably and then sold you the means to record your imprisonment. By the end of August 1943, the 500 men of that initial transport had settled in to camp life. They'd established their own internal hierarchies, elected barracks leaders, organized sports teams, even started a chess club. The camp began to feel less like imprisonment and more like an extended garrison posting in some foreign land. Uncomfortable, certainly, frustrating, absolutely, but not the nightmare they had been conditioned to expect. On September 1st, Lieutenant Morrison posted a notice on the barracks bulletin board. It was written in formal German, grammatically perfect. Recreational opportunity available Saturday, September 4th. 50 volunteers may attend a local cultural event in Hearne. This is a privilege, not a right. Only prisoners with exemplary conduct will be selected. Sign-up list available at camp administration. The notice generated immediate debate. What kind of cultural event? Some suspected propaganda. They'd be paraded through town as defeated enemies while civilians jeered. Others thought it might be a church service, a transparent attempt to convert godless Nazis to American Christianity. A few optimists suggested it might be a dance or musical performance, though what entertainment value existed in a town of 10,000 was anyone's guess. Schultz signed up immediately. So did Lieutenant Muller, Sergeant Hauser, and 47 others selected for their good behavior and lack of escape attempt history. On Saturday morning, they were issued clean uniforms, their Wehrmacht dress uniforms, surprisingly, cleaned and pressed, though stripped of insignia that might prove controversial. American MPs loaded them onto 3 trucks under light guard. The weapons were visible but not ostentatiously displayed. The overall atmosphere felt more like a school field trip than prisoner transport. The trucks rolled through farmland and forest, past cotton fields where black workers and Mexican laborers picked under supervision of men on horseback, past timber operations where crews cut pine trees that would become telephone poles or construction materials for the war effort, past everything that made rural Texas in 1943 function: the agriculture, the resource extraction, the grinding daily labor that nobody in Europe thought about when they imagined America as a nation of lazy capitalists getting rich off others' work. Downtown Hearne appeared suddenly, a grid of streets lined with brick buildings 2 and 3 stories tall. Storefronts advertised dry goods, hardware, a pharmacy, 2 banks, a movie theater showing something called Casablanca. People moved about their Saturday business, shopping, chatting, children running between buildings in games of tag. The truck slowed but didn't stop, continuing through town toward the outskirts. Then they saw the crowd. Hundreds of people gathered around a large fenced area, a proper arena maybe 100 yards across, surrounded by wooden bleachers that rose 10 rows high. Pickup trucks and a few automobiles parked in disorganized rows. Families spread blankets on the ground beyond the bleachers. The smell of cooking meat, barbecue they would learn later, drifted across the field along with music from a brass band warming up somewhere out of sight. "Ah," Sergeant Hauser said confidently, "a propaganda rally. They'll parade us around, show the locals their defeated enemies, maintain morale on the home front." But that theory collapsed when the trucks parked in a section of bleachers that had been cordoned off with rope. Americans sat all around them, families, elderly couples, young people on dates, even children eating popcorn from paper bags. The guards gestured for the Germans to sit. And then the guards sat too, pulling out their own popcorn, clearly more interested in whatever was about to happen than in watching their prisoners. This was not a propaganda rally. A loudspeaker crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 19th Annual Hearne Labor Day Rodeo. The voice belonged to a woman, enthusiastic and drawling, her English accent thick with Texas flavor. We got us a full program today: bull riding, bronc riding, steer wrestling, calf roping, and barrel racing. Our first event, starting in just 5 minutes, is bareback bronc riding. Several Germans exchanged confused glances. Rodeo. The word meant nothing to them. Some kind of sporting event, clearly, but what sort? The arena contained no markings for a ball field, no goalposts, no racing track, just dirt, some wooden gates at one end, and what appeared to be livestock pens beyond the fencing. Then the first gate opened, and all hell broke loose. The horse that exploded into the arena wasn't running. It was erupting, 1,000 pounds of fury launching itself skyward, with a man clinging to its back like a drowning sailor to driftwood. The animal twisted mid-air, came down hard on stiff legs that sent shockwaves through its body and the man on top, then immediately launched again in a different direction. No pattern, no predictability, pure chaos. The rider had one hand buried in a leather rigging cinched around the horse's midsection. His other arm flailed high, never touching the animal, working for balance like a tightrope walker in a hurricane. His legs clamped tight around the horse's barrel, spurring with boots that had 2-inch rowels. 8 seconds. That's all he needed. 8 seconds before the horn sounded. He made 6. The horse executed a corkscrew twist that defied anatomy, and the cowboy separated from his mount violently, spinning through air before hitting dirt hard enough to raise a cloud of dust. 2 men on horseback immediately swept in, pickup men, they would learn later, positioning themselves to allow the thrown rider to grab onto their horses and scramble to safety, while the bucking horse continued its tantrum toward the exit gate. The cowboy stood, limping slightly, retrieved his hat from where it had landed 20 feet away, and waved to the crowd. The bleachers erupted in applause. He grinned, showing a gap where a front tooth used to be, and limped out through the arena gate. Captain Schultz leaned forward, his military mind immediately attempting to process what he'd just witnessed through the only framework available to him. Cavalry training, he muttered to Lieutenant Mueller beside him. They are teaching soldiers to maintain control when mounts panic under artillery fire. Notice how the rider never released his grip despite the violence of the movement. Combat conditioning for unpredictable situations. Mueller nodded slowly, the explanation making sense. But why do it publicly? Why the audience? Morale building, Schultz theorized. The Americans are clever about propaganda. They embed military training into civilian entertainment, make it seem like sport rather than preparation for war. Maintains operational security while building public support for cavalry units. The theory gained credibility with each subsequent event. The next bronc rider, a lanky teenager who couldn't have been older than 17, drew a horse called Satan's Daughter. The animal lived up to its name, achieving what looked like 7 feet of vertical height on each buck. The kid lasted the full 8 seconds somehow, his body absorbing punishment that should have broken bones. When the horn sounded and the pickup men rescued him, his nose was bleeding, his lips split, but he was grinning like he'd just won a war.
The Germans watched with growing fascination as rider after rider took their turns. Some lasted the required 8 seconds, most didn't. The horses varied wildly. Some bucked in tight circles, others ran the length of the arena while bucking. A few simply exploded in place like coiled springs repeatedly compressed and released. The riders showed bruises and blood, but kept that same fierce grin, that same hungry look in their eyes like they were competing for something far more important than whatever prize money might be involved. The Americans must have extensive cavalry reserves, Sergeant Hauser observed, pulling out a small notebook he'd been allowed to keep. Count them. We've seen 14 riders so far, and the announcer mentioned this is just the first event. If they're maintaining this many training facilities across the country, that's a massive mounted force we weren't accounting for in our intelligence estimates. After the bareback bronc riding came saddle bronc riding, which looked similar but with the addition of a western saddle and stirrups.
The mechanics changed slightly. Riders could use the stirrups for leverage but still had to keep one hand free, waving in the air for balance. These horses seemed slightly less violent, though less violent remained relative when discussing animals actively trying to murder the humans on their backs. Then came the bull riding, and the Germans' military theory seemed to solidify into certainty. Bulls made the horses look gentle. The first bull, a massive black beast named Tornado, according to the announcer, weighed at least 1,800 pounds of solid muscle and bad intentions. When the gate opened, it didn't just buck, it rotated, twisted, spun, and launched itself in every direction simultaneously while somehow moving forward at terrifying speed. The rider managed 3 seconds before the bull executed a maneuver that sent him flying. He landed face first, got to his hands and knees, then had to scramble desperately as the bull, no longer distracted by the weight on its back, decided to finish what it started. 3 rodeo clowns, men in baggy pants and face paint who'd been standing seemingly idle in the arena, sprang into action. They shouted, waved, positioned themselves between bull and fallen rider. One clown even slapped the bull's hindquarters, redirecting its attention. The bull charged the clown instead, who dove into a padded barrel that the animal then proceeded to roll around the arena like a toy. The crowd roared with laughter while the thrown rider escaped to safety. Combat rescue simulation, Lieutenant Mueller breathed, watching the clowns work. The entire scenario, rider attempting to control an enemy asset, support team extracting casualties under fire, distraction tactics to redirect enemy attention. This is tactical training disguised as entertainment. Brilliant, actually. The bulls proved even more devastating than the horses. Rider after rider got thrown, sometimes within 2 seconds of the gate opening. The animals didn't just remove their passengers, they seemed personally offended by the attempt and actively tried to stomp, gore, or otherwise murder anyone foolish enough to have climbed on. The rodeo clowns earned their pay repeatedly, risking genuine injury to protect thrown riders. One bull, introduced as Eliminator, had thrown 43 consecutive riders, according to the enthusiastic announcer. Ain't nobody yet figured out how to ride this son of a gun. The crowd cheered the bull's success rate like it was a point of pride rather than a training failure. That particular detail struck Schultz as odd, but he filed it away for later analysis. Perhaps the Americans celebrated difficulty to motivate their trainees, build morale through achievable but challenging standards. The calf roping event seemed to confirm all their theories. Cowboys on horseback charged out of gates pursuing released calves. The riders swung lassos in perfect circles above their heads, precision tools that required genuine skill to deploy effectively. When released, the ropes flew straight and true, dropping over the calves' heads with accuracy that came only from extensive practice. The horses immediately planted hooves and leaned back, keeping the rope taut, while the rider dismounted, sprinted to the calf, and tied 3 of its legs together with a smaller rope in under 10 seconds. Reconnaissance and target capture techniques, Sergeant Hauser declared, sketching diagrams in his notebook. Notice the coordination between horse and rider. The mount maintains rope tension without verbal command. That level of training takes months, possibly years, and the roping itself translates directly to combat capture of enemy personnel or equipment. The steer wrestling, bulldogging in local parlance, looked even more tactical. Cowboys leaned from galloping horses to grab running steers by the horns, used momentum and technique to twist the animals' heads and flip them onto their sides. Pure strength, combined with leverage and timing. The fastest competitor completed the feat in 4.2 seconds, from gate to downed steer. Close-quarters combat training, Lieutenant Mueller observed, teaching soldiers to use enemy momentum against them. The strength required is significant, but the technique is what matters. This could apply to hand-to-hand fighting or subduing prisoners. Only the barrel racing confused them temporarily. Young women, actual civilians in colorful shirts and cowboy hats, raced horses in cloverleaf patterns around 3 large barrels. They leaned into turns so aggressively their stirrups nearly scraped dirt, pushing their horses to maximum speed on straightaways before sliding into the next turn. The horses responded with precision that spoke to extensive training, pivoting on their hind quarters, accelerating explosively, stopping on invisible cues. Reconnaissance messenger training, one German lieutenant suggested, teaching rapid directional changes while maintaining speed. Could be useful for communication runners operating in contested areas where evasive maneuvers are necessary.
But why use women? Another prisoner asked. The Americans have women in their military? Not formally, Schultz said slowly, working through the implications. But perhaps they're training civilian auxiliary forces, total mobilization of the population, similar to our own Volkssturm concept. Everyone contributes to the war effort in their own capacity. The afternoon wore on through event after event. Team roping, where two cowboys worked in perfect coordination to rope a steer's head and hind legs simultaneously. Steer roping, a variant that required even more skill. Each event demonstrated genuine athletic ability, combined with obvious extensive training. The cowboys weren't amateurs. They moved with the confidence of professionals who'd spent years perfecting their craft. And yet, little details didn't quite fit the military training theory. The announcer kept mentioning prize money, $75 for first place in bull riding, $50 for bronc riding, smaller amounts for other events. Why pay soldiers to train? The competitors came from diverse backgrounds, according to the running commentary. Ranchers, yes, but also oil workers, farmhands, even a school teacher from Waco. One bull rider worked at a gas station during the week and competed on weekends. The families watching behaved oddly too. They cheered when riders succeeded, but also seemed to celebrate the animals' victories. When Eliminator threw his rider in under 2 seconds, a significant portion of the crowd applauded the bull. Children jumped up and down excitedly when a bronc executed a particularly spectacular buck that set its rider flying. This didn't match the behavior of civilians watching military training. They were treating it like entertainment, like a sporting event where outcomes mattered less than the quality of performance. Ernst Frohman, the former university professor who taught American literature before being conscripted, sat quietly throughout the rodeo, watching his fellow prisoners develop their elaborate theories. He'd read Mark Twain, Zane Grey, Owen Wister. He'd studied Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis. He understood, or thought he understood, that American mythology centered heavily on cowboys and Western expansion. During a break in the action, while arena crews prepared for the next event, he leaned over to Captain Schultz. "Herr Hauptmann, may I suggest an alternative interpretation?" Schultz, still scribbling notes about observed training techniques, looked up. "Yes?" "What if this isn't military training at all? What if Americans simply enjoy watching dangerous activities, the way we might attend a boxing match or football game?" The captain stared at him like he'd started speaking Chinese. "Enjoy it? These men are getting seriously injured. We've seen blood, broken bones, likely concussions. One rider was knocked unconscious. The medical staff had to carry him out on a stretcher. What kind of society considers that entertainment rather than tragedy?" "The American kind, perhaps," Frohman suggested gently. "Their culture glorifies individual risk-taking, the frontier mythology, the cowboy as hero, the celebration of personal courage over collective purpose. What if this rodeo represents that cultural value system rather than military preparation?" Schultz shook his head. "That makes no sense strategically. Why would a nation at war waste resources on meaningless displays of individual recklessness? Every man in that arena could be working in a factory or farm, contributing to the war effort. Instead, they risk serious injury for what? A clause? No, there must be military purpose. The Americans are clever. They hide their preparation in plain sight." Frohman said nothing more, but his doubt had planted itself. The afternoon continued. More events, more spectacular crashes, more proof, in the eyes of most Germans, that they were witnessing a sophisticated training program for cavalry reserves and specialized combat units. As the rodeo concluded with a final bull riding championship round, the prisoners boarded their trucks for the return journey to Camp Hearne. They talked excitedly, comparing notes, debating the finer points of what they'd witnessed. The Americans had revealed something important today, a glimpse into training methodologies, into how a democracy prepared for war without the overt military culture that characterized Germany. It was clever, they agreed, deceptive even, using civilian entertainment to mask military readiness. Only a handful remained quiet during that ride back to Camp Hearne. Professor Frohman, troubled by what he'd seen, a few younger prisoners who'd noticed the genuine joy on cowboys' faces, the way they celebrated even when they lost, the way the crowd cheered for the performance rather than the outcome, for the courage displayed regardless of success or failure. That night in the barracks, Schultz compiled his notes into a formal report he intended to submit through proper channels. There were intelligence officers who debriefed prisoners regularly, and this seemed like valuable information. His report detailed the training facility, the rodeo arena, the various tactical exercises, each event, the coordination between units, cowboys and support staff, and the sophisticated use of public entertainment to maintain operational security. Across the barracks, Professor Froman wrote in his own journal. His entry reflected deeper uncertainty. Attended what Americans call a rodeo today. My companions interpret it as covert military training. I am less certain. The violence is real, undeniably, but so is the joy on the faces of participants. They volunteer for this. Nobody forces them. They compete not for military honors, but for belt buckles and modest prize money. The crowd celebrates them as heroes, local heroes perhaps, but heroes nonetheless. If this is truly training, it is training built on principles foreign to our understanding. The Americans don't order their men to climb onto bulls. They don't need to. Their men do it anyway, for reasons I cannot fully grasp.
The seed of doubt had been planted, but for most of the 500 Germans who'd attend that September rodeo, their military interpretation remained firmly rooted. They'd returned to camp that evening convinced they'd uncovered American secrets, never realizing the truth was both simpler and far more complex than any training program. They'd witnessed American culture laid bare, the good, the reckless, the inexplicably stubborn courage of free people who chose their own challenges. And that choice, that fundamental exercise of individual liberty, would prove harder to understand than any military tactic. September turned to October, and Camp Hearne settled into routines that were becoming familiar. The prisoners worked their details, attended their classes, played their sports, and argued endlessly about the rodeo. Word had spread throughout the camp, even to prisoners who hadn't attended. The stories grew with each retelling. The bulls got bigger, the crashes more spectacular, the military implications more obvious. The camp administration, pleased with what they viewed as successful cultural engagement, announced a second rodeo trip for late September. This time, 200 prisoners signed up. Guards had to create a lottery system to select attendees fairly. Captain Schultz prepared for this second visit with methodical German efficiency. He created an observation checklist. Count the participants, note their apparent military ranks. Surely the most skilled riders were senior personnel. Track the training progressions from simple to complex exercises. Identify any standardized techniques that suggested formal military doctrine. Lieutenant Mueller, assigned to attend the second rodeo, received his own instructions. Focus on the horses, Schultz told him. Breeding, training methodology, how they rotate animals through exercises, that will tell us about their cavalry logistics. Sergeant Hauser got tasked with observing the medical response protocols. He said, they have emergency procedures that look well drilled. I want to know how they evacuate casualties, what medical supplies are staged, and how quickly they can stabilize injured personnel. The second rodeo trip happened on September 25th under a sky so clear and blue it hurt to look at. The Germans arrived with notebooks, with heightened attention to detail, with the focused intensity of intelligence officers conducting reconnaissance. They watched the opening ceremony, cowboys on horseback carrying flags, galloping in formation around the arena while the national anthem played. The pageantry struck them as militaristic, confirming their theories. But then small details began accumulating, tiny cracks in the military training hypothesis that some prisoners couldn't ignore. The rodeo secretary, a woman in her 50s wearing turquoise jewelry and a white Stetson, ran the entire event from her announcer's booth. She controlled the timing, decided the event order, settled disputes between competitors with an authority that suggested she outranked everyone present. If this was military training, why was a civilian woman in charge? One prisoner theorized she might be a psychological operations officer using a cover identity. Another suggested she was the base commander's wife, wielding authority through her husband's rank. The simpler explanation, that she was just the rodeo secretary, a professional position in the rodeo circuit that required no military affiliation whatsoever, didn't occur to them. The bareback bronc riding featured a horse called Widowmaker that had earned its name by hospitalizing 12 riders over the past 2 years. The announcer shared the statistic with evident pride, even joking that the horse had a better winning record than most of the humans. The crowd laughed appreciatively. Contestant number 7,
a teenager who looked like he should still be in school, drew Widowmaker for his ride. Lieutenant Mueller watched closely as the kid climbed into the bucking chute, settled onto the horse's back, wrapped one hand in the rigging. The kid's face showed concentration, but also something else. Anticipation, maybe even excitement. Not the grim determination of a soldier facing necessary danger, but the eager intensity of someone about to do something they genuinely wanted to do. The chute opened, Widowmaker lived up to its reputation, executing a corkscrew mid-air twist that looked physically impossible. The kid flew off after 4 seconds, landed hard on his shoulder, and lay in the dirt for a moment while medical personnel sprinted over. He waved them off after a few seconds, stood up gingerly, grabbed his hat, and limped out to thunderous applause. Despite obvious pain, he was grinning, laughing even, as his buddies near the chutes slapped his back and razzed him about the short ride. Mueller watched Captain Werner, Schultz, sitting 2 rows ahead. The captain was staring at the injured cowboy with an expression of confusion that mirrored his own thoughts. What military training exercise deliberately used an animal that had a perfect record of defeating every participant? What tactical value existed in practicing a skill where failure was virtually guaranteed? Wouldn't a competent training program rotate that horse out after it proved too difficult for the skill level being taught? The calf-ropping event brought new information that complicated the narrative further. The announcer explained that the current arena record, 7.2 seconds from gate to tied calf, belonged to a rancher named Jimmy Crawford from Amarillo. The announcer added almost as an afterthought that Jimmy had never served in the military, had a wife and 3 kids at home, and ran about 400 head of cattle on his family's ranch.
Never served in the military. The Germans processed this information slowly. A civilian held the record? That meant civilians competed directly with military personnel in these exercises. Or did it mean something else? The steer wrestling brought more confusion. The event required genuine physical strength and technique, no question. Cowboys leaped from galloping horses to grab running steers by the horns, plant their boots, and use leverage to twist the animals down. It was brutal, effective, and undeniably impressive. But the announcer mentioned that one competitor was a school teacher from Dallas who practiced steer wrestling on weekends. Another worked construction during the week. A third was, improbably, a Baptist preacher who'd taken up rodeo after his knees gave out from football. A preacher doing this on weekends for fun. The bull riding remained the most spectacular and dangerous event. Bulls that outweighed their riders by 1,500 pounds or more. Animals that seemed to take personal offense at the concept of being mounted. The Germans watched Tornado, the bull with the perfect record, throw another rider in under 3 seconds. The crowd cheered. The cowboy who'd just been violently separated from his ride and nearly trampled stood up, retrieved his hat, and actually bowed to the crowd like a performer on stage. This wasn't military training. The realization crept through the German prisoners like cold water seeping through cracks. This was something else entirely, something they lacked the cultural framework to understand. After the rodeo, during the truck ride back to camp, the conversations were more subdued than after the first visit. Some prisoners clung to the military training theory because abandoning it meant confronting something far more unsettling. But others, particularly those who'd paid attention to the details, felt the first stirrings of genuine curiosity about American culture. That evening, Lieutenant Mueller approached Professor Frohman in the camp library. The professor was reading Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, one of the few American novels available in German translation. "You were right," Mueller said quietly, sitting down across from the professor, "about the rodeo. It's not military training, is it?" Frohman closed his book, marked his page. "No, I don't believe it is." "Then what is it? Why do they do it?" The professor considered his answer carefully. "I think it's about proving something to themselves, about testing limits.
The cowboys don't perform for their government or for any collective purpose. They do it for personal glory, for the respect of their peers, for the simple challenge of riding an animal that doesn't want to be ridden. It's individualism taken to an extreme we don't have in German culture. The idea that personal achievement, even in something as seemingly pointless as staying on a bull for 8 seconds, has intrinsic value regardless of whether it serves state purposes. Mueller shook his head slowly. That's chaotic. How does a society function if everyone is just pursuing individual glory? Where's the collective discipline, the shared purpose? Perhaps that is their shared purpose, Froman suggested. The right to pursue individual challenges, to choose your own risks. Their society functions because everyone agrees to protect that freedom, even if they disagree about how individuals use it. The conversation was interrupted by Captain Schultz entering the library. He looked haggard, like he hadn't slept well. He pulled up a chair without asking, his usual military formality diminished. I spoke with Corporal Henderson today. The American Guard had become something of an unofficial cultural liaison, happy to answer questions about Texas life. I asked him directly about the rodeo, about whether it was military training. And? Froman prompted. He laughed. Not mockingly. He thought I was making a joke. When he realized I was serious, he spent 20 minutes explaining rodeo history, how it started with cowboys competing during cattle drives in the 1800s, how it evolved into organized events by the 1890s. He showed me a magazine article about professional rodeo circuits, prize money, championship rankings. It's an industry, apparently. People make their living traveling from rodeo to rodeo, competing for purses and sponsorships. People make their living doing this? Voluntarily getting trampled by bulls? Mueller leaned forward. According to Henderson, yes. The best cowboys can earn significant money, not as much as factory work or military service, but enough to survive if they win consistently. Most do it part-time alongside ranch work or other jobs. Some do it because their fathers did it, passing skills down through generations. Others do it because they love it. Henderson used that word, love. They love the challenge, the adrenaline, the competition. The three men sat in silence, processing this information against everything they'd been taught about how societies should function. In Germany, love was reserved for family, homeland, perhaps one's duty to the nation. You didn't love getting thrown from livestock. You didn't pursue serious injury for entertainment and small prize money. Yet these Americans did exactly that. And the same Americans who voluntarily climbed onto bulls on weekends were the same ones building ships, flying aircraft, and winning battles across 2 oceans.
"I need to revise my intelligence report," Schultz said finally, standing up. "Command will want accurate information about American culture, not my misinterpretations." He paused at the library door. "Though I'm not sure my accurate report will make any more sense to them than my original theory did." October and November brought changes to Camp Hearne as the German prisoners began engaging more deeply with American culture, not through official programs but through organic curiosity. Guards and prisoners had more conversations. Work details became opportunities to interact with local Texans. Small cultural exchanges multiplied. Franz Brunner, the young Bavarian private, worked a detail at a ranch owned by a man named Walter Morrison, no relation to Lieutenant Morrison from camp administration. Walter was 63, too old for military service, running his ranch with a skeleton crew of elderly workers and prisoners of war. He treated the Germans firmly but fairly, showing them proper techniques for mending fence, managing cattle, and maintaining equipment. One afternoon in late October, Walter noticed Franz watching the ranch hands practice roping in a corral. "You interested in learning?" Walter asked, in heavily accented but functional German he'd picked up working with the prisoners. Franz hesitated. "Is this rodeo training?" Walter laughed, not unkindly. "Son, this is ranch work. Though I suppose if you got good enough at it, you could compete in rodeo if you wanted.
but mostly it's about catching cattle that need medical attention, moving stubborn animals, dealing with escapes. Practical skills, not sport. But the rodeo cowboys, they do this for sport. Some do both, Walter explained, pulling out a rope. Lots of rodeo competitors are working cowboys who got good at their jobs and decided to test themselves competitively. Others just loved the challenge. Here, let me show you the basics. Franz spent the next hour learning to swing a lasso, under the supervision of an American guard who seemed more amused than concerned about a German prisoner learning cowboy skills. The rope work was harder than it looked, getting the proper loop size, maintaining the spin, releasing at the right moment. Franz failed repeatedly, but each failure taught him something. After an hour of practice, he managed to rope a fence post from 10 feet away. The achievement felt absurdly satisfying. Walter had watched the attempts with the patience of a natural teacher. You've got decent coordination. Keep practicing and you might get competent. Though I'll tell you what I told my own boys. Being able to rope a standing post is different from roping a moving calf. That takes years, not hours. Why do they do it? Franz asked, the question that had been plaguing him since the first rodeo. The cowboys at the rodeo, they get hurt, sometimes badly. The prize money isn't much. Why risk it? Walter considered the question seriously. Different reasons for different folks. Some do it for money. $75 is a week's wages or more for most working men. Some do it for the competition, proving they're the best. Some do it because their daddies did it. Family tradition. But mostly, he looked directly at Franz. They do it because it makes them feel alive. Because mastering something difficult, something dangerous, that proves something to yourself about who you are. Not to the government, not to your boss, not to anyone else. Just to yourself. This explanation resonated with Franz in ways he didn't fully understand. In Germany, individual achievement always served collective purposes. You excelled in sports to glorify the nation. You took risks in military service to defend the homeland. You worked hard to contribute to economic productivity. The idea of taking significant personal risk purely to prove something to yourself with no larger collective benefit was genuinely foreign. But it was also compelling. There was a purity to it, a simplicity that cut through the layers of ideology and propaganda. A man on a bull. 8 seconds. Nothing else mattered in that moment. Not politics, not nationality, not the war raging across the world. Just human will against animal power. Conversations like this multiplied across the camp. German prisoners asked questions. American guards and local workers answered. The exchange worked both ways. Americans were curious about Germany, about the war, about why educated men had followed Hitler into catastrophe. The Germans, their information filtered through years of propaganda, were curious about everything. One evening in the mess hall, a debate erupted that Captain Schultz found himself mediating. 2 prisoners were arguing about American society, their voices rising above the dinner clatter. "They're weak," insisted Hauptmann Richter, a committed Nazi who'd been a party member since 1931. "All this individual choice, this lack of central direction, it's chaos. How can they possibly win against our organized society?" "Then why are we in this camp and they're outside the wire?" counted Lieutenant Becker, a more pragmatic officer who had soured on Nazi ideology after witnessing atrocities in Poland. "Production means nothing without will," Richter snapped. "They're soft, decadent. Look at this rodeo nonsense. Grown men playing cowboy for pocket change. That's not strength. That's a society that's lost its way."
Is it? Professor Froman interjected quietly. Or is it a society that's found a different way? They don't need the government to order their men to be brave. Their men choose bravery. They don't need propaganda to motivate sacrifice. Their cowboys risk broken bones for belt buckles. Their soldiers volunteer for combat. Their workers buy war bonds voluntarily. What if that voluntary courage is stronger than compelled obedience? The mess hall had grown quieter, other prisoners listening to the debate. Schultz decided to let it continue. These philosophical arguments were better than despair or boredom. "But it's inefficient," Richter argued. All this individual choice, all these personal pursuits, it diverts resources from optimal allocation. In Germany, we channel everyone toward collective goals. That's how you build a great nation. Germany is losing the war, Becker said flatly. Our great collective nation is getting bombed into rebel while we sit in a Texas prison camp eating better food than our families at home. Maybe efficiency isn't everything. Maybe there's strength in their chaos we never understood. This debate, and dozens like it, represented something crucial happening within Camp Hearne. The prisoners were beginning to question the fundamental assumptions they'd been taught about American society. Not everyone questioned, certainly. Plenty remained true believers in Nazi ideology, dismissing everything they saw as temporary weakness or clever deception. But for others, the cognitive dissonance became impossible to ignore. They'd been told Americans were soft, cowardly, divided by class and race into a dysfunctional society. Yet the evidence contradicted this at every turn. The guards were professional and competent. The local workers were productive and skilled. The nation was clearly winning the war through industrial might and military effectiveness. And the cowboys, those strange, reckless cowboys, embodied a kind of courage that defied everything the prisoners had been taught about how courage should manifest. By early November 1943, the news from Europe began filtering into camp through newspapers and radio broadcasts that prisoners were allowed to access in limited amounts. The Wehrmacht was retreating on the Eastern Front. Italy had switched sides. Allied bombing campaigns were intensifying. The propaganda that had promised inevitable German victory was looking increasingly hollow. The psychological impact varied wildly among the prisoners. Some retreated further into ideology, insisting that secret weapons or brilliant strategies would turn the tide. Others fell into depression, mourning a homeland being destroyed, and families they couldn't protect. A small but growing number began the painful process of ideological reconstruction, questioning everything they'd believed about the war, their government, and their own choices. The rodeo, oddly enough, became a touchstone in these personal transformations. They could observe it directly, without the filter of propaganda or official narratives. They could see the cowboys choosing danger. They could watch the crowd celebrating individual achievement. They could witness a community gathering not because the government ordered it, but because people wanted to be there. Sergeant Hauser, the tank commander who'd first theorized about cavalry training, wrote to his wife in November. The letter was censored and saved in camp records. "I have seen something here that troubles me. Americans do dangerous things voluntarily, without orders, without ideology driving them. They climb on wild animals for sport. They compete for small prizes and personal glory. At first, I thought this proved their lack of serious purpose. Now I wonder if it proves something else, that a nation of people who voluntarily choose their challenges may be stronger than one where challenges are assigned. I do not know anymore what to think about many things." The Christmas season brought special activities to Camp Hearne. The prisoners organized a holiday pageant, decorating the recreation hall with handmade ornaments and a tree donated by a local church. American guards attended the celebration, sharing food and singing carols in both languages. This surreal scene, enemies sharing Christmas dinner behind barbed wire, crystallized the strange nature of their captivity. During the celebration, Corporal Henderson approached Professor Froman with a question. "Can I ask you something? Why did you all think the rodeo was military training? What made that seem more likely than entertainment?" Froman considered his answer carefully, wanting to explain without justifying. "In Germany, we organize society around collective purposes. Leisure time is structured, directed toward improving body or mind in ways that serve the state. The Hitler Youth doesn't just play, they prepare for future service. Our athletic festivals celebrate national strength, not individual achievement. The idea that people would gather to watch other people risk serious injury purely for entertainment, with no larger social purpose, we simply lacked the framework to understand that." Henderson nodded slowly. "So what changed your mind?" "Details. Small inconsistencies that didn't fit the military theory.
the woman running the event, the prize money instead of military honors, the fact that the crowd cheered for bulls that threw their riders. Eventually, I had to accept that Americans simply view leisure differently than we do.
You celebrate individual choice and personal challenge as ends in themselves, not means to collective goals. And that troubles you? Henderson asked.
It troubles some of my companions, yes. It forces us to reconsider assumptions about how societies should function. If America can be powerful while allowing all this individual chaos, what does that say about our belief that strength requires central control? From on past. It's a painful question for men who justified terrible things in the name of that collective strength. The conversation reflected a broader shift happening in the camp. Not universal, not even affecting the majority of prisoners, but significant nonetheless. Some men were beginning the long process of ideological awakening, questioning the Nazi worldview that had shaped their adult lives. The third rodeo trip happened in December, just before Christmas. 50 prisoners attended, including some who'd been initially skeptical but were now curious. This time, they watched with different eyes, not analyzing military tactics, but trying to understand cultural meaning. The bull riding still looked terrifying. The bronc riding still seemed unnecessarily dangerous. But now they could appreciate it as performance, as sport, as a cultural expression of values that differed fundamentally from their own. They watched a cowboy get thrown hard, land badly, and refuse medical attention so he could stay for his second ride later in the program. They saw the crowd's respect for that determination, even as they surely recognized the foolishness of risking further injury. After the rodeo, a local rancher named Bill Thompson approached the German prisoner section with his 10-year-old son. The guards tensed, but allowed the interaction. Thompson spoke no German, but he gestured to his boy and then to the arena, pantomiming riding. His son was competing in junior rodeo. He managed to communicate through a guard who translated. Started with sheep riding at age 5, graduated to calves, would move up to junior bulls next year. The Germans stared at this man, who was proudly describing how his elementary school child was learning to get thrown from livestock. The cognitive dissonance was profound. What kind of father deliberately trains his son for a hobby that guarantees injuries? What kind of society celebrates this as normal childhood development? But looking at Thompson's obvious pride, at the boy's excitement talking about his next competition, they began to understand something fundamental about American culture. This wasn't child abuse or neglect. This was a father passing down skills and values, courage, perseverance, the ability to get back up after getting knocked down. These were the same values Germans claimed to prize, but in manifesting in such different forms that they'd been initially unrecognizable. The trip back to camp was quieter than the previous visits. The prisoners were thinking, processing, comparing. Some were troubled, some remained dismissive, but many were beginning to see America as it actually was, not as propaganda had portrayed it. A complex, contradictory society where individual freedom produced both chaos and strength, where volunteerism generated commitment that compulsion could never match, where cowboys risking death for belt buckles somehow contributed to a nation capable of fighting wars across 2 oceans. January 1944 brought word that the Allied invasion of Europe was being planned. The writing was on the wall for anyone willing to read it. Germany would lose this war. The only questions were when and at what final cost. In Camp Hearne, life continued its strange routine. Work details, meals, recreation, the endless waiting. But something had shifted subtly. More prisoners were learning English. More were engaging with American guards and workers not as enemies, but as people. More were questioning the ideology that had brought them to this place. Captain Schultz submitted a final report to German intelligence officers who occasionally debriefed prisoners. In it, he described American society as he now understood it. The United States achieves through voluntary cooperation what we attempt through compelled obedience. Their strength lies not in central direction, but in the willingness of individuals to contribute to shared goals while pursuing personal interests. Their culture celebrates risk-taking and individual achievement in ways that initially appeared chaotic, but actually generate resilience and innovation. Their cowboys, whom we initially mistook for soldiers in training, exemplify this perfectly. They voluntarily choose danger because personal challenge has value in their society, independent of collective benefit. This cultural difference explains much about why the war has progressed as it has. The report disappeared into intelligence channels and was likely never seen by anyone who could act on its insights. By January 1944, such insights were irrelevant anyway. The war's trajectory was set. But for the men who'd experienced that awakening, who'd moved from viewing the rodeo as military training to understanding it as cultural expression, something profound had shifted. They'd glimpsed a different way of organizing society, a different understanding of what made people strong and nations powerful. They'd seen that freedom, properly channeled, could generate the same dedication and sacrifice that totalitarianism demanded, but with one crucial difference. Free people chose their commitments, and chosen commitments they were discovering proved more durable than imposed ones.
Spring 1945 arrived with a cascade of news that shattered any remaining illusions. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over, and the Third Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had collapsed after 12. In Camp Hearne, the prisoners received the news in stunned silence. Some wept openly, mourning not the Nazi government, but the homeland they knew was devastated. Some remained defiant, insisting this was temporary setback before Germany's resurgence. Most simply felt numb, processing the end of everything they'd fought for. The camp administration handled the situation carefully, increasing security while simultaneously offering additional recreational opportunities to prevent despair from turning into unrest. The war was over, but the prisoners couldn't go home yet. Germany was divided into occupation zones, still smoldering from years of bombing. The infrastructure to repatriate hundreds of thousands of POWs simply didn't exist. They would wait here, in Texas, while their country was rebuilt under Allied supervision. In May 1945, a special rodeo was organized in Hearne to celebrate VE Day. It was a controversial decision. Some locals objected to anything that might be seen as coddling defeated Germans. But others argued that showing American culture at its finest would drive home the philosophical differences that had won the war more effectively than any punishment could. 100 German prisoners attended, including many who'd been at that first rodeo in September 1943. 20 months had passed since that initial confusion about cavalry training. 20 months of gradual cultural education, of questioning assumptions, of watching their homeland lose a war that propaganda had promised they'd win. This time, they watched the rodeo with full understanding of what they were seeing. The bull riding wasn't tactical training, it was pure reckless courage applied to pointless purpose. The bronc riding wasn't cavalry conditioning, it was humans testing themselves against animals for no reason except the challenge itself. The calf roping wasn't reconnaissance practice, it was working cowboys demonstrating ranch skills in competitive format. And somehow, understanding this made it more impressive, not less. Sergeant Hauser, watching a cowboy climb onto a bull called war paint, turned to Professor Frohman. "You know what frightens me most about this?" "What?" "That bull doesn't care about ideology. It doesn't care about Nazi or democracy, German or American. It just wants to throw that cowboy into the dirt. And that cowboy doesn't care about those things in this moment either. He just wants to stay on for 8 seconds. There's a purity to it, a simplicity. Man versus challenge, stripped of all the ideological layers we wrapped around everything." Frohman nodded. "Perhaps that's what we lost. We made everything about the collective, about the nation, about ideology. These Americans kept space for the personal, for the individual challenge that has no larger meaning except what it means to the person doing it. Maybe there's strength in that. strength we couldn't see because we had been taught to dismiss anything that didn't serve state purposes. The cowboy lasted 6 seconds before Warpaint executed a spin that defied physics. The rider flew 10 feet, landed hard, got up, grinning. The crowd roared appreciation, not for his success, but for his courage in attempting. After the rodeo, several prisoners stayed to talk with cowboys through interpreter guards. The conversations were awkward but genuine. Franz Brunner, who'd learned basic roping skills working ranch details, asked a competitor about his worst injury. The cowboy, a weather-beaten man of 40-something, lifted his shirt to show a scar running from sternum to hip. A bull's horn had opened him up like a zipper in 1938. "Why do you keep competing?" Franz asked through the interpreter. The cowboy considered the question seriously. "Because the day I let fear stop me from doing something I love is the day I start dying. I'd rather risk getting killed doing something that matters to me than live safe doing things that don't." The interpreter translated, and Franz was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, "We were taught that individual desires should be subordinated to collective needs, that personal risk should only serve larger purposes. But you risk death for personal satisfaction, and your country is the one that won the war. I don't understand how both things can be true, but they are." The cowboy shrugged. "Freedom means the freedom to make your own choices, even stupid ones. Government that tells you what risks you can take, what challenges you can pursue, that ain't freedom. That's control dressed up as safety. I'd rather be free and busted up than safe and told how to live." That sentiment, expressed by a semi-literate cowboy who probably couldn't locate Germany on a map, captured something that months of philosophical debate in camp hadn't quite articulated. The German prisoners had been raised in a system that promised security through obedience, strength through unity, greatness through collective sacrifice. They'd subordinated individual desires to state purposes, accepted restrictions on personal freedom for the supposed good of the nation, and they'd lost everything. Meanwhile, these chaotic Americans with their rodeos and individualism and messy democracy had won. The contradiction forced uncomfortable questions about which system actually worked, which philosophy actually generated national strength, which approach to society actually protected its people.
The repatriation process began slowly in late 1945 and accelerated through 1946. Prisoners were shipped out in groups, loaded onto trains to East Coast ports, then onto ships heading back to Europe. The journey reversed their arrival 3 years earlier, but everything was different now. Captain Schultz departed in November 1945. He'd been assigned to the British occupation zone, which meant he'd be going home to a Germany split between former allies who were already eyeing each other suspiciously. Before leaving, he donated his notebooks to the camp administration, detailed observations about American culture that he thought might prove useful for understanding this nation that had defeated them. Lieutenant Mueller left in December 1945, heading to the American zone where his family lived in what remained of Munich. He'd lost 2 brothers on the Eastern Front and didn't yet know whether his parents had survived the bombing campaigns. The return home filled him with dread rather than relief. Sergeant Hauser, Professor Frohman, and Franz Brunner all departed in January 1946, part of a larger group heading to the French zone. They stood on the deck of the transport ship as it left New York Harbor, watching the Statue of Liberty recede into the distance. 3 years earlier, they'd passed that same statue as prisoners of war, bitter and defeated. Now they passed it again. Still prisoners technically, but changed in ways they couldn't fully articulate. "I'm going to miss the rodeos," Hauser said, surprising his companions. "That sounds insane, I know, missing watching cowboys nearly kill themselves for pocket change. But I will. It reminded me that there's more to life than following orders and serving some grand purpose. Sometimes doing something difficult just because it's difficult, that's enough." Frohman nodded. "The American experiment, and it is an experiment, they're making it up as they go, proves that freedom and strength aren't contradictory. Their cowboys and their democracy and their messy individualism defeated our discipline and unity and collective purpose. We need to remember that. Whatever Germany becomes, it can't be what it was." Franz, the youngest of them, asked the question they were all thinking. "Do you think we'll ever return?
To America, I mean. To Texas. Some of us might, if they'll have us, if we can earn redemption for what our nation did, but most of us will live with this as memory. The strange years when we were prisoners who weren't really prisoners, when we learned more about freedom while behind barbed wire than we'd known while supposedly free. The years that followed were hard for Germany. The country lay in ruins, divided between occupation zones that would eventually harden into the east-west split. Food was scarce, housing scarcer. Millions of refugees and displaced persons overwhelmed the shattered infrastructure. The full scope of Nazi atrocities became public knowledge, forcing Germans to confront what had been done in their name. For the former POWs who'd spent the war in Texas, the contrast between their experience and the experience of those who had remained in Germany created complicated feelings. Survivors' guilt mixed with gratitude, mixed with shame. They'd eaten well while their families starved. They'd been safe while cities burned. They'd learned about American freedom while the Holocaust murdered millions. But some found ways to use what they'd learned. Captain Schultz, though he never returned to Texas, became a teacher in rebuilt Hamburg. He taught history and civics, emphasizing democratic values and individual rights in ways that would have been dangerous under the Nazis. His lectures often included stories about American culture, about cowboys and rodeos, and the messy but resilient nature of free societies. Frohman published a memoir in 1952, Gefangene der Freiheit, Prisoners of Freedom. It detailed his time in Camp Hearne and the gradual awakening he'd experienced. The book found modest success in Germany, where citizens were rebuilding both their country and their understanding of what society should be. Frohman's description of the rodeo, the confusion turning to understanding, became a minor cultural touchstone, a metaphor for Germans learning to appreciate democracy after years of totalitarianism. Franz Brunner did return to Texas, though not until 1958. He'd written to Walter Morrison, the rancher he'd worked for during his imprisonment. The correspondence had continued sporadically across 12 years. When Franz finally saved enough money for passage, Walter helped him navigate immigration procedures. Franz settled near Hearne, worked various ranch jobs, eventually married a local woman and raised 3 children who grew up Texan with German surnames. He taught them to rope. Not because it had military value or served some collective purpose, but because it was a skill worth knowing, a tradition worth preserving, a connection to his adopted homeland. His son competed in high school rodeo. Franz attended every event, watching with the critical eye of someone who'd learned the basics from patient teachers decades earlier. Watching his son ride broncs terrified him, but he never discouraged it. Freedom meant the freedom to choose challenges, even dangerous ones. That was the lesson he'd learned, and he wouldn't deny it to his children. The reunion started in the 1970s, organized by former POWs who wanted to reconnect with the strange chapter of their lives spent in American camps. The first major gathering happened in Germany in 1976, bringing together men who hadn't seen each other in 30 years. They were elderly now, in their 60s and 70s, wearing the weight of decades that had transformed Europe beyond recognition.
They shared stories about Camp Hearne, about work details and educational classes and the food they'd eaten. But inevitably, conversations returned to the rodeos, the confusion, the gradual understanding, the cultural awakening that had begun with cowboys and bulls. "We were so arrogant," one veteran said, "so certain we understood the world and America's weakness. Then we saw men voluntarily climbing onto animals that could kill them, doing it for belt buckles and local fame, and we couldn't process it. Because in our ideology, individual achievement without collective purpose was waste. We'd lost the understanding that personal challenge has intrinsic value. The Americans didn't defeat us through their rodeos, they defeated us with tanks and planes and industrial production. But where did those tanks come from?" the first veteran countered. "From a society that rewarded individual innovation, that allowed creative chaos, that trusted its citizens to contribute voluntarily rather than compelling obedience? The rodeo wasn't their strength, it was a symptom of the cultural values that generated their strength. We couldn't see that because we'd been taught those values were weaknesses.
This debate continued into the night, fueled by beer and nostalgia and the complicated feelings of men who'd been on the wrong side of history but were trying to extract meaning from their experiences. The reunion group decided to reach out to Hearne, proposing a visit to the town where they'd been imprisoned. The response from Texas was cautiously welcoming. The war had been over for 30 years. The men who'd committed atrocities weren't the same men who'd been prisoners in Texas. Reconciliation seemed possible. In 1982, 3 former prisoners made the journey. Otto Hilgenberg, who'd written journals during his captivity, Werner Schultz, the captain, who'd theorized about cavalry training, and Heinrich Werner, the Luftwaffe pilot. They were elderly men now, accompanied by family members who'd heard stories but never quite believed them. The local newspaper covered their visit. Elderly Texans who remembered the camp came forward with photographs, artifacts, stories about German prisoners who'd worked on their farms or attended their churches under guard. The rodeo came up repeatedly. Locals remembered the confusion of German prisoners trying to make sense of bucking broncs and bull riders. "We thought y'all were spies," one elderly woman said, laughing. "Thought you were taking notes for some military purpose. Never occurred to us you just didn't understand rodeo was for fun. We thought you were conducting elaborate training exercises disguised as entertainment. It seemed impossible that people would voluntarily do something so dangerous for such small rewards unless there was hidden military purpose. We couldn't conceive of a society where personal challenge had value independent of collective benefit." "And now?" someone asked. Schultz was quiet for a moment, looking around at the town square that had changed remarkably little in 40 years. "Now I understand that strength comes in different forms. Germany today is democratic, peaceful, prosperous, everything the Third Reich wasn't despite its claims of superior strength. We learned eventually that the American way, messy, individualistic, chaotic, actually works. The rodeo taught us that, though we were too stubborn to learn quickly." The visit included attending a modern rodeo, the same annual event that had confused them decades earlier. They watched with full understanding now, appreciating the skill and courage, laughing at their younger selves who'd mistaken entertainment for military training. The cowboys they watched were younger than their grandchildren. The world had moved on. In 1986, a historical marker was erected at the site of Camp Hearne. Little physical evidence of the camp remained. Farmers had reclaimed the land, plowing under foundations and filling in latrine pits, but the marker commemorated the facility that had held nearly 5,000 German prisoners during the war. The ceremony included both former prisoners and former guards, elderly men who'd once been enemies, now sharing stories and coffee. Someone suggested they all attend that year's rodeo together, prisoners and guards, side by side, united by their shared history with this strange Texas tradition. They went. Elderly men in their 70s and 80s watching cowboys in their 20s and 30s climbing onto bulls and broncs. The symmetry was powerful. New generations testing themselves against livestock, embodying values that had contributed to defeating fascism and winning the war. After the rodeo, a reporter asked the former prisoners what they thought of it now, decades later, with full understanding and perspective. Heinrich Werner, the pilot who'd survived the war and built a successful architecture practice in Munich, answered thoughtfully. "The rodeo represents everything we fought against and everything we lost to. Individual courage serving no purpose beyond the challenge itself, personal risk accepted voluntarily, community celebration of achievement without ideological content. We thought these things made America weak. We were catastrophically wrong." "Do you wish Germany had been more like America?" the reporter asked.
"Germany today is democratic, like America," Werner said carefully. "What I wish is that we'd learned these lessons in 1933 instead of 1945. That we'd understood freedom and strength aren't contradictory before we embarked on the path that destroyed us. The rodeo didn't teach us that. It merely symbolized it. Americans climbing onto bulls for belt buckles, while their nation built the industrial machine that buried us. Both came from the same cultural source, trust in individuals to make their own choices, even dangerous or seemingly pointless ones." "So you're grateful for your time as prisoners here?" Werner chose his words carefully. "I'm grateful I survived the war when millions didn't. I'm grateful that being captured by Americans meant I was treated humanely when that was far from guaranteed in that war. And yes, I'm grateful that my time here opened my eyes to different ways of organizing society, of understanding freedom, of valuing individual dignity.
The rodeo was a small part of that, but it symbolized something larger. America's chaotic strength that we couldn't comprehend until we'd lost everything. The story of German POWs and Texas rodeos became a historical footnote, occasionally mentioned in academic papers about cultural exchange or the POW experience in America. Camp Hearne itself became a minor historical site, visited occasionally by researchers and descendants of men who'd been imprisoned there. But for the men who'd lived through it, who'd arrived in Texas expecting brutality and found humanity, who'd watched rodeos thinking they were seeing military training and gradually understood they were witnessing cultural expression, who'd been forced to question everything they believed about strength and freedom and national power, it remained a defining experience. They'd been prisoners of war who'd learned more about freedom while captive than they'd known while supposedly free. They'd been enemies of America who'd been treated better than they'd treated their own occupied populations. They'd been true believers in Nazi ideology who'd found that ideology couldn't explain or survive contact with American reality. And it had started with cowboys on bulls, with men voluntarily doing dangerous things for belt buckles and local glory, with a community gathering to celebrate individual courage applied to pointless purpose. The Germans had tried to find military meaning in the rodeo because military meaning was all they'd been taught to recognize. Personal challenge for its own sake, individual achievement without collective validation, voluntary risk without compelled obedience, these concepts were so foreign to their worldview that they'd required elaborate alternative explanations. But once understood, those concepts proved more powerful than any they'd brought to the war. A nation of people who voluntarily chose their challenges, who celebrated personal achievement, who trusted citizens to make their own decisions, even stupid, dangerous ones like climbing onto bulls, had defeated the nation that compelled obedience and subordinated individual desires to collective purpose.
The rodeo hadn't won the war. Industrial production, military strategy, Allied cooperation, German overreach, and countless other factors had determined the outcome. But the rodeo had symbolized the cultural values that made American victory possible. And for German prisoners forced to confront the failure of their ideology, understanding that symbolism had been the first step toward a different understanding of how societies could function and what made nations truly strong. By the turn of the 21st century, most of the men who'd experienced that strange cultural awakening in Camp Hearne were gone. Captain Schultz died in 1991, just after Germany reunified. Professor Frohman passed in 1998, having lived to see his country become a peaceful democratic power. Heinrich Warner made it to 2003, attending one final reunion in Germany before his health failed. Franz Brunner, the youngest of the prisoners profiled, lived until 2007. He died in Texas, in a small house near Hearne, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew his story but couldn't fully understand what it had been like to live it. His funeral was attended by both German-American descendants and local ranchers who'd known him for decades. Someone suggested they scatter his ashes at the old rodeo grounds. His son, speaking at the funeral, told a story his father had shared countless times, but never tired of repeating. Dad said the moment he truly understood America was not at the rodeo, but later, working on Walter Morrison's ranch. He'd asked Walter why Americans did dangerous things voluntarily when nobody forced them to, and Walter had looked at him like he'd asked why the sky was blue. "Because it's our choice," Walter had said simply. "That's what freedom means. The right to make your own choices, even choices other people think are stupid. Government that protects you from yourself isn't protecting you, it's controlling you." Dad said those words stayed with him for 70 years, because he'd grown up in a system that justified every restriction, every control, every limitation on freedom as protection. Protection from bad ideas, from dangerous influences, from making wrong choices. And he'd believed it. They all had. Until they came here,
and saw what real freedom looked like: messy, dangerous, sometimes stupid, but fundamentally more powerful than any controlled system could be. He used to joke that it took watching cowboys nearly kill themselves for belt buckles to understand why America won the war. But it wasn't really a joke. Those cowboys symbolized something Dad's generation had been taught didn't exist: strength through freedom, rather than strength through control. Individual courage that didn't need ideology to justify it. Personal challenge that had value simply because someone chose to pursue it. Dad became an American citizen in 1964. He voted in every election after that, never missed one. He said voting was a responsibility he took seriously because he'd seen what happened when citizens stopped choosing their government and let government control them. And yeah, he took his kids to rodeos, even though it scared him half to death watching us ride, because he learned that protecting kids from every danger wasn't love. It was preparing them for challenges and trusting them to handle it. The story captured something essential about the strange legacy of German POWs in Texas. These men had arrived as enemies, convinced of their ideological superiority, certain that American freedom was weakness. They'd left, years later, having learned lessons that would shape the rest of their lives. Not all of them changed. Some clung to Nazi beliefs until death. But enough changed that their stories became part of the larger narrative of how Germany transformed itself from fascist dictatorship to peaceful democracy. And the rodeo, that strange, violent, quintessentially American cultural expression, remained at the center of many transformation stories. Not because the rodeo itself was particularly important, but because it had crystallized something German prisoners couldn't ignore. Americans voluntarily did difficult, dangerous things for personal reasons, and that voluntary courage built a society strong enough to defeat compelled obedience. The historical record of this peculiar cultural collision exists in fragments. Otto Hilgenberg's journals, donated to the University of Texas. Official camp records detailing recreational programs and prisoner activities. Oral histories collected in the 1980s and 1990s from elderly veterans on both sides. Local newspaper archives from Hearne documenting the POW camp's existence and its integration into the community. Academic historians occasionally write about the POW experience in America, noting the relative humanity of American camps compared to alternatives. Camp Hearne gets mentioned in passing, one of many facilities that held German prisoners while they worked American farms and learned American culture through osmosis. But the rodeo story remains mostly oral tradition, passed down through families and shared at veteran reunions. The Germans who mistook entertainment for military training, who couldn't comprehend voluntary danger, who gradually learned that freedom and strength weren't contradictory. It's a good story, with clear narrative arc and satisfying character development, the kind of story that gets better with each retelling. Whether it's historically accurate in every detail is less important than what it represents, the profound cultural gulf between Nazi Germany and democratic America, and the strange paths through which understanding could develop. These weren't philosophical dialogues in university seminars. These were enemy soldiers watching cowboys ride bulls and slowly, painfully, questioning everything they'd been taught about how society should function. The modern descendants of both prisoners and guards occasionally connect through genealogy websites and historical societies. They share photographs, exchange stories, piece together family histories interrupted by war. Some descendants have visited Hearne, walking the now empty fields where the camp once stood, trying to imagine what their grandfathers experienced. And some attend the rodeo, the annual tradition that continues regardless of wars, politics, or historical memory. They watch modern cowboys climb onto bulls that weigh more than small cars, watch them get thrown with violence that looks designed to kill, watch them get up, grinning and waving to crowds who appreciate the courage more than the outcome. These descendants understand something their grandfathers took years to learn. The rodeo isn't about military training or practical purpose. It's about testing yourself against a challenge simply because the challenge exists. It's about personal courage that doesn't need ideological justification. It's about a community celebrating individual achievement in something that matters to the people doing it, even if it serves no larger collective purpose.
That's the lesson German prisoners eventually learned in Texas, though it took most of them years to fully internalize it. Freedom means trusting people to make their own choices, even dangerous or seemingly pointless ones. A society built on that trust might look chaotic compared to regimented control, but chaos that emerges from individual choice proves more resilient, more creative, more powerful than any imposed order. The rodeo symbolized that principle in its purest form. Nobody forced cowboys to compete. Nobody required attendance. Nobody justified the violence through appeals to national greatness or collective purpose. It existed simply because people chose to participate. Riders choosing danger, spectators choosing to watch, communities choosing to celebrate a tradition that connected them to frontier heritage and cowboy culture. For German prisoners conditioned to believe that individual choice without ideological purpose was frivolous waste, this was genuinely incomprehensible initially. But once comprehended, it revealed the fundamental weakness of totalitarian thinking. Systems that require forcing people to be brave will always lose to systems where people choose bravery voluntarily. The story ends not with dramatic revelation, but gradual understanding that continued long after the war. German prisoners returned home to rubble and defeat. They rebuilt lives in a divided country struggling to confront its past and construct a democratic future. Most lived ordinary post-war lives. They worked, raised families, voted in elections, tried to forget or rationalize their participation in a catastrophic ideological project.
But some carried with them memories of Texas, of rodeos, of slowly learning that their assumptions about American weakness were catastrophically wrong. These memories became teaching moments for children and grandchildren, cautionary tales about the dangers of ideological certainty and the surprising sources of national strength. When Captain Schultz taught civics to German students in the 1950s and 60s, he often began with a question: what makes a nation strong? Students would offer predictable answers: military power, economic productivity, technological advancement, national unity. Schultz would nod, acknowledging these factors, then describe a scene that initially confused his students as thoroughly as it had confused him 20 years earlier. I once watched a man voluntarily climb onto an animal that weighed nearly a ton and whose sole purpose was to throw him into the dirt as violently as possible. He did this not because anyone ordered him to, not because it served any national purpose, not because ideology demanded it. He did it for 8 seconds of personal challenge and a belt buckle. And the community that gathered to watch him celebrated his courage regardless of whether he succeeded or failed. That man was American. His nation defeated mine. This is not coincidence. A country where citizens voluntarily choose difficult challenges, where personal courage has value without ideological justification, where individual freedom generates commitment that compulsion can never match, that is a strong country in ways we failed to understand until we'd lost everything. His students didn't always understand the lesson immediately, but it planted seeds, made them think about freedom and strength in ways German education had neglected for a generation. Some of those students became the leaders who rebuilt Germany into a peaceful, democratic power. They carried forward lessons learned not just from military defeat, but from cultural encounters that revealed the surprising strength of seemingly chaotic freedom. Professor Frohman's memoir reached broader audiences, getting translated into English in 1965 and finding modest success in America. American readers were fascinated by the reverse perspective, seeing their own culture through enemy eyes, understanding how alien American individualism appeared to people raised in collectivist ideology. The rodeo chapters became the most quoted sections, perfectly capturing both the initial misunderstanding and the gradual awakening. Franz Brunner's quiet life in Texas represented perhaps the most complete transformation. He had arrived as a teenage prisoner of war, convinced of Nazi superiority and American decadence. He'd departed years later with those convictions shattered, but uncertain what should replace them. He'd returned by choice,
immigrating to his former prison, building a life in the culture that had defeated him. His children grew up American, knowing their father's history, but shaped by Texas culture that valued individual choice, personal responsibility, and voluntary courage. When his granddaughter asked him late in his life whether he regretted anything about his wartime service, he thought for a long time before answering. "I regret fighting for evil. I regret that it took defeat and captivity to open my eyes to that evil. I regret the years I wasted believing propaganda that should have been obviously false. But I don't regret being captured by Americans, or being sent to Texas, or gradually learning that everything I'd been taught about strength and freedom was backwards. Those years as a prisoner educated me better than any university could have. And watching cowboys ride bulls taught me more about what makes nations powerful than any military academy." "Cowboys on bulls taught you about national power?" his granddaughter asked, confused by the apparent non sequitur. "The cowboys symbolized it," Franz clarified. "American strength comes from trusting citizens to make their own choices. Those choices sometimes seem stupid, climbing on bulls, starting businesses that might fail, moving across country for opportunities, speaking unpopular opinions. But societies that trust those choices, that protect individual freedom even when individuals use it foolishly, those societies generate creativity and resilience that controlled societies can never match. We Germans tried to organize everything, control everything, direct everything toward collective purpose. No wasted effort, no frivolous individual pursuits, everyone serving the state. And we built a powerful military machine that nearly conquered Europe. But we lost to nations that let their citizens waste time on rodeos and jazz music and baseball, nations that trusted individuals to figure out their own purposes rather than assigning purposes from above. That contradiction, our efficient control losing to their messy freedom, that's what I needed to understand. The cowboys helped me understand it. They voluntarily risked their necks for belt buckles, and their country won the war. Both came from the same source, a culture that valued individual choice more than collective efficiency. We thought that was weakness. It was our destruction." The last reunion of Camp Hearne veterans happened in 2005, organized by descendants rather than the veterans themselves. Most were too elderly or deceased to attend. 50 people gathered in Germany, half descendants of prisoners, half historians and interested parties. They shared artifacts, photographs, documents. Someone had even found old newsreel footage from 1943 showing German prisoners at work in Texas fields. But the centerpiece of the reunion was a video compilation of rodeo footage spanning from 1940s films to modern professional events. The organizers thought it would provide historical context, show what the prisoners had seen, bridge past and present. The effect was more powerful than anticipated. Watching a bull rider from 1943 followed immediately by a bull rider from 2003 demonstrated the continuity of tradition. The same events, same rules, same voluntary danger spanning generations. American culture had transformed in countless ways over 60 years, but cowboys still climbed onto bulls for personal challenge and community celebration.
One of the few surviving prisoners, confined to a wheelchair but mentally sharp, watched the footage with tears in his eyes. When asked what he was feeling, he struggled to articulate it. "We thought we were watching military training. We thought we were cleverly decoding American preparations for war. We were so arrogant, so certain we understood everything, but we understood nothing. We couldn't see that the rodeo represented exactly what made America dangerous to us, people who voluntarily choose difficulty, who don't need ideology or orders to be courageous, who celebrate individual achievement without requiring it to serve collective purposes." 60 years later, they're still doing it, still climbing onto bulls, still risking broken bones for belt buckles. And Germany is peaceful and democratic, rebuilt according to the very principles we fought against. The rodeo won in its way, not through force, but by symbolizing values that proved stronger than our forced obedience and compelled courage. The reunion ended with attendees toasting both the prisoners who'd survived and the guards who'd treated them humanely, recognizing that the strange chapter of enemy imprisonment in Texas had contributed, in small but meaningful ways, to German transformation from fascist dictatorship to democratic partner. And somewhere in Texas that same weekend, another rodeo was happening. Cowboys were climbing onto bulls. Crowds were gathering to watch. The tradition continued, utterly indifferent to the historical weight it carried in German memory, simply existing as it always had. Americans choosing their own challenges, celebrating personal courage, maintaining traditions that connected present to past without requiring ideological justification. That's what the German prisoners eventually learned to appreciate. Not every tradition needs to serve larger purposes. Sometimes people do things simply because those things have meaning to the people doing them. And societies that protect that freedom, the freedom to pursue personal meaning even in dangerous, seemingly pointless pursuits, generate a strength that compulsion can never match. The rodeo didn't teach German prisoners about military tactics. It taught them about freedom. And that lesson, though it took years to fully learn, proved more valuable than any military intelligence could have been. Because understanding freedom, understanding that it's not weakness, not chaos, not frivolous waste, but rather the foundation of genuine strength, that understanding helped rebuild Germany into something better than what it had been.
All from watching cowboys ride bulls. All from misunderstanding what they were seeing, then slowly, painfully, learning to see it clearly. All from the strange collision of Nazi ideology with Texas culture playing out in a small camp where enemies learned to see each other as human beings with fundamentally different but legitimate ways of organizing society. The story of German POWs and Texas rodeos is ultimately a story about perception, about how deeply cultural conditioning shapes understanding, and about the slow process of learning to see the world through different frameworks. It's about the journey from certainty to doubt to new understanding. It's about humility learned through defeat and wisdom gained from unexpected sources. And it's about cowboys on bulls, voluntarily risking death for belt buckles, symbolizing everything Nazi Germany had misunderstood about American strength until it was far too late to matter. The tradition continues. The lessons remain relevant. And the story endures as a reminder that understanding enemies requires more than military intelligence. It requires grasping the cultural values that shape how people think about courage, freedom, strength, and what makes life worth living. Sometimes those values reveal themselves in unexpected places. Sometimes they appear in rodeo arenas, where men climb onto animals for no better reason than the challenge exists and they choose to accept it. Freedom looks like chaos until you understand it. Then it looks like strength. That's the lesson. That's what the cowboys taught, whether they knew it or not. That's what the Germans learned, prisoner by prisoner, rodeo by rodeo, year by year. And that's why this strange historical footnote, enemy soldiers mistaking entertainment for military training, matters more than its apparent absurdity might suggest. Because it captures, in one perfect cultural collision, the fundamental difference between the societies at war. And it shows how understanding can develop through the most unlikely sources when people are forced to confront assumptions they never knew they were making. The rodeo goes on. The lessons endure. And somewhere, in memory and in continuing tradition, cowboys still ride bulls while the world watches and learns.